So let's start with the topic of vaccinations, and I'm going to turn the conversation over to Ron to kind of give us state of the industry, where we're at right now. Things are changing day by day. Announcements are being made about AstraZeneca and whatnot, and I think we'd look to you for a timely update as to what's currently going on. So Ron, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Giovanni, and thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, especially on stage with Norm. Always good to get a fulsome picture of what's happening. I want to give you a little bit of an update on a few things. If we go just the next slide, we have vaccinations. So the prioritization of essential workers was launched this week, the week of May 10th. Some information on vaccinations and workplace health and safety, an update on the rapid antigen screening program, and some adjustments that we've made to the PPE, masking, and eye protection. So if we go to the next slide, back in March, you can see that the prioritization guidance for phase 2 populations, essentially workers that cannot remain at home. The province had tried to prioritize those professions and those jobs that, given the availability of vaccinations, could be rolled out in a sequential order. And we worked with the construction industry, predominantly the OGCA, ResCon, Build, COCA, and advice through the building trades to come up with language that would be inserted into the document. And this is just the title document, but in actual fact, if you see in the second bullet point, workers in manufacturing industry directly involved in supporting the COVID-19 response, construction, including infrastructure and other essential business and services. So we added this language. The chief coroner, who was Dr. Durkheyer, who was responsible for this, had connected with me and said, can you come up with some language that we incorporate into phase 2, group 2? So if we go to the next slide, the rollout, as you can see, and again, it's based on availability of vaccinations. If you look at the middle column, week of May 10th, in the last block, it says cannot work from home, group 2. So group 2 is construction. So it rolled out on Monday, May 10th, and I got a lot of calls from the trades and a number of people up north in industries who tried to log on, but they couldn't. We had a meeting yesterday. Construction is now up, so people can book. There's no guarantee that you'll get it on the day that you book, but you can certainly book through the provincial government website, or, as you know, there are vaccinations available through pop-up and local public health departments. We are working very closely with a number of construction general contractors and trades in working with various public health departments. Back about 2 weeks ago, construction or industry was asked if they wanted to work with public health, local public health offices in developing and setting up vaccination clinics for not only workers, but also for the communities and hotspots. They would entertain those requests. So we had a couple of them. We had Modern Niagara had submitted a plan on the Ottawa Construction Association, as well as Ellis Don. We've had Local 27 express an interest, and these are people that are offering up either their facilities or headquarters in hotspot municipalities to deliver the vaccinations to not only their workers, but also to the community. And it's quite an intensive process to be able not only to be selected, but actually to set it up, because the host, that being the construction firm that is doing it, really has to cover all the costs with the exception of vaccinations. You will get a lot of support though from the local public health and the local municipality. So we do have one that's going to start up on May 19th, and that will be at the Elliston offices on Middlegate in Mississauga. And it will be available to construction workers and families who live in that municipality, as well as the general public in that hotspot. There's also some interest being expressed in the Toronto area, the City of Toronto, through Toronto Public Health. However, it has not moved as rapidly as has the efforts in Peel. Now, part of the reason is the timing of this, simply because the region of Peel has made it their priority to vaccinate pretty much everybody going forward. So we do have more vaccinations available now than we did have a couple of weeks ago. So there may be an opportunity to again entertain firms or associations that wish to host a vaccination clinic. So if we go to the next slide, please. We do have guidance material on vaccinations in the workplace health and safety. And, you know, Norm is going to talk about rights and obligations of the employer and so on. What we're advocating, that what we want is to ensure that employers inform their employees about the importance of not only PPE, not only the importance of ensuring that you have safe work practices, not only at work, but also at home, but also provide information to people on vaccinations. It's important that people be informed. And, you know, what we want to do is, the ultimate goal is to prevent workers from being exposed to a habit or a hazard. Vaccinations are a good complement to workplace controls, but cannot replace them. We are making it very clear in all of our communication that even though you may have got one vaccination, that does not make you immune. You can still get it and you can still spread it. So until such time, employers are encouraged to continue with the toolbox talks and continue to provide information to workers and to continue to be vigilant when it comes to ensuring that you have proper masking procedures, maintaining physical distances, and of course, disinfecting, etc. So we have released guidance materials for your workplace on vaccines and workplace health and safety. They do not talk about rights and responsibilities. What they do talk about is what's expected of the worker and the employer when vaccinations have occurred. So if we go to the next slide, and Norm will talk a bit more about the nuances of vaccinations from an employer-employee perspective. So just on the rapid antigen screening program for a minute, construction has been very active in the Toronto Peel area, where are the two major hotspots on the news in terms of, you know, roughly 50% between Toronto and Peel are occurring in those two municipalities. So there was a really aggressive rollout of the rapid antigen screening program, beginning with a pilot project in December and then rolling out more aggressively in February and March. We are now up to roughly 20 to 22,000 rapid screening tests occurring on a weekly basis. It's now gone provincial-wide, and I'll explain some changes that have occurred in the last week. But to construction, we have shipped out over 350,000 tests, and we probably administered close to about 125,000. Now, of those, 268 have tested positive, and roughly half of those have tested confirmed through a PCR test. Now, it's important to note these numbers are really important. That's about on 100 and give or take 100 25,000 actual screening tests being done, your positivity rates are relatively low, which is good for the industry. It demonstrates that the industry is taking its responsibilities seriously. And this was one of the intents of the rapid screening when we first got involved. It was interesting when we started it. Medical officers of health are not consistently in full agreement that this is the way to go. But once we had the opportunity to explain to both Dr. Lowe and Dr. Davila that the extent of the rapid screening that was going on in some of the larger sites in Toronto and Peel, they were actually quite impressed. And our meeting yesterday with the construction consortium had indicated that they're taking this into consideration when there is an outbreak. So we've got good uptake. These are the numbers as of May 11th. We've had about a dozen in the past last week, I guess, that have joined the program. And the province announced on Monday that it was going to move to a more, shall we say, easier method of providing rapid screening availability, less bureaucratic, less cumbersome, and smaller firms can just go directly to a website. If you go to the next slide, I can give you a bit more information on that. So there is a new portal, and beginning May 7th, you can provide COVID-19 screening at their workplace, and they're eligible to receive the free rapid tests through the Ontario Together website. If you just log on there, there is a website, ontario.ca/testing on site. And if you go to that, you can register. If you're an association or a trade association, you can register on behalf of your members, or as individual organizations, you can register as well. So the tests are free. There will be a couple of announcements coming probably this week. They still have to be approved yet. That will even further reduce some of the obligations that are currently in place with respect to reporting. Reporting not only the results of your testing through to the government, but also requirements of reporting in public health. So it's a screening tool. It's not a diagnostic tool. If you're an open business, you're encouraged to use it. If you're still closed under ROA or the Emergency Act in the province, getting the test won't get you to open until the government says you're open. As indicated, it is not a diagnostic tool. If someone tests positive, there's about a 25% false positivity rating, but it's a great way to ensure that either your employees are free from COVID from an asymptomatic perspective. And again, the same issues arise that do in vaccinations. Can you force your employee to do it? Well, remember that what you're trying to do is limit the transmission of the virus within the workplace. So it's a really important consideration to make if you're adopting it. We've had discussions with labor, many of the trade organizations and unions. They're not against rapid screening. They just want to be spoken to and engaged in the process if you're going to roll it out. The bottom line is everybody wants to keep the business open and construction open. And I think people are rowing in the same direction in that regard. So next slide. We have some new guidance in terms of what to do with rapid screening. So those can be found at that website. And again, the whole effort here is to reduce transmission. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about PPE, masking, and eye protection. So it does remain the best practice that all workers wear masks that provide source control and to protect other people, and indoors at all times, obviously, and outdoors where physical distancing cannot be maintained. Now, what we're saying is the best practice is that, you know, people go, well, if I can stay greater than 6 feet or 2 meters away from somebody, I don't need to wear a mask. Well, it's sometimes difficult. These variants of concern are really, their transmissibility is just so much greater than what we started with in May. So we are saying that indoors, a surgical mask must be worn as part of PPE to provide source control and protect other workers. And we're also suggesting that we should consider not only PPE, surgical procedural mask, but also eye protection if you are within 2 meters of an individual at all times. And what this will give you is the public health. If you have a number of workers working indoors, have come in contact with each other, and you have an outbreak, if you have people that are wearing proper PPE, including eye protection, then public health guidance will not require you to send those people home and isolate. So what I'm talking, if you're in an enclosed space where you will frequently come in contact with people, whether you're drywalling, mudding, all of the indoor work that's going on, if people are wearing eye protection and proper PPE and there is an outbreak, then self-isolation may not be required by that public health unit. Okay, so this is a really important point that you need to consider. Next slide. And so we are trying to align this under OSHA and with public health guidance. So as you can see, we now require use of eye protection appropriate mask within 2 meters of another person, indoors or outdoors. And there has not been a change to ROA for this, but we have changed the guidance. So if you have an inspector coming in and you see people within 2 meters of another person and they're not wearing the proper PPE, you will be issued an order to correct that. So when workers are performing tasks that require them to work within 2 meters of another person without a barrier, such as plexiglass or a partition, then PPE is needed. So we're trying to give people a bit of a common sense approach to this to be able to interpret what's needed. We have always said since the beginning that if you're traveling in a vehicle with another person, if you're in a room with another person and you are less than 2 meters, then you should wear a mask and you should wear eye protection. And it's even more important now because of these variants of concern, because of the vector of transmission is much more significant. So we would suggest that you do that. We're still looking at congregating during breaks and lunch rooms and traveling with people in a vehicle as being the principal causes of transmission in the workplace. However, relatively speaking to the number of hours of construction, the number of people working in construction right now, we are seeing some outbreaks, but certainly not at a significant level as other sectors have. So these new guidance materials can be found on the COVID-19 website. And if you want, I will send the direct links through to Giovanni and we can distribute it to the members here. Next slide. I think that's it for me.
Fantastic. Okay. All right, so we've got a couple of questions that came in from the audience, and I think I'm going to ask one of them of you, but it may be better suited for Norm, but I'm going to ask regardless. The question is, currently, vaccines are not being administered in accordance with the original trials, with longer periods between first and second doses than those during those trials. How do we manage the scenario where a worker is refusing to be vaccinated other than in accordance with the dosage intervals used during the trials. Is that something that I think Norm will be talking about? Or Ron, basically what it is the trial period was, what is it, 28 days that you were supposed to get between vaccinations, and now it's been extended to 4 months. And the question I think asks, how is it that we can manage a scenario where a worker is refusing to be vaccinated other than in that 28-day period? I don't think that they can refuse based on the fact that when you actually get your notice for a vaccination, you're automatically given your second one at a 3 or 4 month interval based on what the timing is from public health. Is that not correct, Ron?
Yeah, you do get notice of when your second shot will be scheduled.
Okay. And just for everyone's edification, the information contained here is being recorded. We are going to distribute this out to everyone, including the slides that Ron had, as well as any of the websites that Ron had talked about. We'll be able to communicate that out. We also have a few more questions in regards to false positives. So I'm going to ask Ron, so the false positive rate for the antigen rapid testing apparently seems quite high. You had mentioned it was about 25%, correct?
Yeah, so it's an asymptomatic person receives a test, it can have about a 25% false positivity rate.
So I then subsequent, I guess, to that question is, but is any work being done to attempt to determine false negatives? That's an interesting question.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I'm sure there's a lot of, I mean, you know, the way that the science is evolving, you know, back in November, you needed a you know, ear, nose, and throat doctor to administer the test. Now it's being self-administered test. It's less invasive. I think both the accuracy of the screening test and the methodology of how it's administered is going to be simplified over the course of the next, you know, weeks and months, and this will become something as easy as probably licking a litmus strip eventually. So, you know, I think technology is going to just improve, as will accuracy, as we go forward.
Okay. Quick, there's a litany of questions coming in, but just out of curiosity, is this the first time that surgical masks are being recommended?
We've always said proper PPE is a surgical grade mask and eye protection if you were in close quarters. It's no different than, you know, what is proper PPE if you're cutting stone. You know, if you're fit tested for a mask, you're wearing goggles and a proper fitting mask. You know, source control outside can be cloth masks and so on, as with inside if you're maintaining the proper physical distancing. But what we're saying is if you are up close and personal with respect to the variants of concern, with the fact that there are now more studies out that that the virus is spread through aerosolization, it just makes great best practice to do all the right things to stop from getting this virus.
Okay, so I've got, apparently I spoke out of turn when I said that you automatically get your second vaccination date. I've got two participants online here who are telling me that they are still waiting to be contacted in regards to their second date. So just out of curiosity, if that is the scenario, what can the individual do in order to ensure that they have that second date?
I would contact their public health unit, their local public health unit.
So just through the Vaccinations Ontario website?
Yeah, you could do that. But if you were vaccinated in the city of Toronto, the public health should have a handle on things.
Okay. Question. I guess based on construction, we're used to having eyewear and glasses and whatnot. Does the requirement for eyeglasses apply to all workplaces or just construction only?
No, it would apply to all workplaces.
Okay.
If you have a barrier, like if you're working, think of it as working in a phone booth, alone in a phone booth and everybody around you, you've got a barrier, okay? If you have no barrier, then you have to create that barrier. You have to engineer out the hazard, which is the mask and the eye protection.
Okay, so we may not be able to get to all the questions today because we do have a second presenter here, but what we'll do is we'll compile them, we'll provide them off to Ron, and then Ron can answer them, because we do have a lot of interesting questions, and some of them sound very specific, and some of them are obviously, the ones that you've answered are rather broad-based. So ultimately, the last, I guess, point that I want to ask is, will the ministry officers be enforcing the use of eye protection on site? Again, I think from a construction standpoint, it's a bit of a moot point, isn't it? You should be wearing it regardless.
Yeah, I mean, in those cases where you have obvious people that are within 2 meters of each other and they're not wearing, then they're going to, they're going to identify that.
So I do have a question in regards to, if a construction worker gets the first vaccination and then in some cases a second vaccination, will they be able to decline having the rapid test on job sites? I actually know the answer to that, and that'll be no. But Ron, what do you think about that one?
You're still even with the vaccination, you're still able to transmit the disease. You can still get it and you can still spread it. So until somebody stands up on a chair and says, this thing is over, we have to continue with the due diligence. That's plain and simple.
So I think a lot of the questions in regards to the second dose are in reference specifically to AstraZeneca. And so a lot of the questions that are being asked are in relation to, because the administration of AstraZeneca is on hold, how do we attend to that? Will public health come out in the next week or so explaining, if you've gotten an AstraZeneca, then you can get a Moderna or a Pfizer and it's just as good? Can you mix and match? I think is the questions that are being asked.
That's being looked in right now. I believe the Minister of Health was on at her weekly briefing or daily briefing, was discussing that it's being explored about mix and match. There's studies going on in Great Britain right now because they've undertaken it. So I think it's fair to say that nobody's going to be left out in the cold on this thing.
Okay, so final question on this one. Interesting enough, if you're in a unit and there's a cluster of you working on a construction site, and everyone's wearing, the proper PPE, face protection, eye protection, and whatnot, and there is one of the individuals comes, you're positive or test positive, does that entire cluster, because they were wearing all the proper eye protection, do they still have to self-isolate? How does that roll out?
So there are some public health units that have changed their procedure, and they have said, look, if you're wearing the proper PPE, and that's the intent of PPE, then there is no need to self-isolate.
Okay, interesting enough. All right, so Ron, again, thank you very much for this incredibly timely update, and I'm assuming that this is changing minute by minute. So if we'll provide out to all of our members any information that we get directly from Ron. As I noted at the onset of this discussion, he is intimately involved in not only vaccinations, but construction in the OGCA and connected to us, kind of tethered to us, if I may. I'm going to switch gears now. We're going to go to kind of like the legal aspects of things now, and Norm Keith will address vaccinations and what employers have to do in regards to that for your policies. But just use the question and answer box. Norm will address all the questions and answers afterward, not during. And so, Norm, take it away.
Thank you, Giovanni. Can you hear me okay?
That would be a positive, yes.
Excellent. So we have about 2 hours worth of material. I'm going to give you in about 30 or 25 minutes. May not answer all your questions, and I may skip over some. This is general and practical guidance for construction employers dealing with vaccine and vaccine policy. I'm not a doctor, and this is not specific legal advice. So let's get into it. To state the obvious, but apparently it needs to be done regularly, is that we're still in a pandemic. The lessons learned from the Spanish flu back in 1918 and 1990 are very simple and very clear. That's when 1/3 of the world was infected and about 50 million people died. In Canada, about 50,000 people died in Canada during the Spanish flu. Terrible, terrible disease. The way we got out of the Spanish flu is essentially population or herd immunity, because there were no vaccines and there were not the antivirals that are available to treat people with COVID that they have today. The simple message is clear. We can either let it spread. Obviously, physical distancing and masking is important, but it doesn't prevent spread. That's what we're living with. That's what almost 25,000 Canadians have experienced and died already from the COVID pandemic. So the only real way out, the only sensible, humane way out, the only way to protect workers as well as the population is through mass vaccination and immunization. So just having some trouble with the slide movement. Let's see what's going on. There we go. Health Canada has approved 4 vaccines. One's a little more controversial, but when you look at the data, not really. And what the vaccine does is give you, in effect, immunization as if you've had it and you have the antibodies. And so you're included in the 80% of herd immunity. You need 80 to 85% herd immunity before you're going to stop mass transmission. And that's going to be a problem because there are a collective, probably 25 to 30% of Canadians who resist vaccines because of hesitancy or because they're committed ideological anti-vaxxers. The Canadian Medical Association, doctors have looked at the Health Canada data, not just me, and have said, look, get the vaccination unless there is a significant reason that you've been advised by your healthcare professional or that you're aware of that you will have an adverse reaction. That'll touch back on that in a minute, dealing with human rights exemptions. Basically, governments have said they're not going to mandate vaccine. The simple and obvious reason is it's still in category the vaccine of emergency use. And secondly, they don't have enough. So they can't tell you to go get it if it's not available. So I'm not going to go through the different vaccine platforms. The newest one, the mRNA, is interesting, a little controversial, but likely the most effective. The viral vector, AstraZeneca, and the Johnson & Johnson, code-named or trade-named Janssen, are clearly the old school vector viral vaccines. And then the one that Canadian taxpayers through the federal government have invested tens of millions of dollars in, the protein subnut Novavax, with the building of their plant in Montreal. That, of course, has not yet been approved by Health Canada, and it's a little more controversial and may not be as effective. Here are the summaries from the CDC, Center for Disease Control, the leading, worldwide leading summary. The 4th column from the left is the important one. Please look at it for a moment. Every vaccine has the 100% protection from hospitalization and death. As Ron said, there's a little bit of uncertainty about whether if you get your second vaccination after 2 weeks of it, you actually may transmit it. The US and the UK are saying no. Ron said yes. I don't know who's right. I just know the UK and the US are well ahead of us. The bottom line is the point behind the vaccine is to be able to be prevented from getting ill and from preventing other people getting the illness that you may get. Not a doctor going to leave you with this, but the key takeaway, even from the AstraZeneca issue that was raised in the Ontario Parliament in the hastily called press conference yesterday, is that although there is a slight risk, and we're talking about a very slight risk of these blood clots, which can of course be treated, there is much more risky medication taken daily, especially by women, than that. And when you put it in perspective, AstraZeneca is clearly still a safe vaccine, but one we're not going to distribute in Ontario, unlike many other countries for reasons you heard maybe yesterday. So the main vaccines are going to be available are Pfizer and Moderna, with Johnson & Johnson coming in as well. The point behind the vaccine, remember, for your workplace is it protects workers from getting sick and it protects workers from infecting other workers. What do you do as an employer with vaccine hesitancy? Well, you communicate factually, consistently, and authoritatively from a medical authoritative perspective, the value of it. I wish there was a simpler, clearer, stronger, and consistent message by all politicians and leaders that it's not up to you, it's not if you want it, it's the right thing to do. I won't comment anymore on political and media confusion around vaccine hesitancy, but as an employer, you need to get the best information you can from the most authoritative sources and communicate that, and strongly, at this point, strongly urge your employees to get vaccine unless they fall into very narrow and rare exceptions. You're going to also, as an employer, have challenges with anti-vaxxers. I've talked to clients who are anti-vaxxers. I've talked to relatives who are anti-vaxxers. An anti-vaxxer, by definition, has an ideological and irrational commitment opposing vaccination per se, and in particular, COVID-19 vaccinations. You may have to, in the fullness of time, when vaccines are available for all your employees in first and second dose, deal with these individuals in a different way. But for now, I think the same message goes to the anti-vaxxer as to the vaccine hesitancy worker, communicating calmly, objectively, medical information about the value of the efficacy and the safety of the vaccine and its benefits for them, co-workers, and their community. We know that governments have, and likely in the future for COVID vaccines, will mandate vaccine, but you don't have governments mandating vaccine for workers as they have in some of the legislation on the slide, because number one, it's still under emergency use. Number two, we don't have enough supply. Supply is the primary problem with vaccination today. So the UK and the US, well ahead of us in vaccine supply, well ahead of us in returning to normal post-COVID. And in the US and the UK, the rule is if you've received your second dose and you're 2 weeks out, you can take away the mask, put it down, you will be fundamentally protected and you will fundamentally protect other people. There might be different views in Canada. Ron said he's going to wait till he sees somebody stand up on a chair and say, you can take your masks off. Well, I'm not sure who that is, if it's a federal official or provincial official, but the point behind vaccines, and if we look to the UK and the US experience, is to, after the second dose, which in Canada, of course, we're doing this unique experiment, nowhere else in the world is doing it, that we're delaying second doses. But when you get your second dose and 2 weeks afterwards, you effectively are prevented from getting it and prevented from giving it to other people. But you may be slow to hear that from Canadian public health because we're behind the UK and the US. The idea that we have purchased more vaccine per capita than any other country in the world still amuses me. It doesn't matter how much you pay for it, it matters how much you receive. So supply is still the primary problem in our vaccine program and distribution. To have government officials and high-level politicians say, we're gonna have a vaccine for everybody who wants one, as if it's optional, apart from certain limited medical or human rights exemptions, is confusing everybody. I wish politicians would be consistent in their message, but I'd also wish for a happier, kinder world, and I'm not sure that's on its way soon. So the point is, this is the context in which employers are thrown with no guidance from the federal government, no guidance from the provincial government on mandatory proof of vaccine policies. And so typically, the Ministry of Labor, sidelined on this issue, has left it to employers to sort this out. That's what we're covering. So let's look at the law. The Occupational Health and Safety Act actually has a primacy or prevail over other statutes clause, section 2.2. In other words, your legal obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act supersede other statutory obligations. Keep that in mind. In other words, safety is priority, safety is paramount. And one couldn't think of a more important time when that should be remembered by everyone in the workplace than in a pandemic. The other interesting duty that workers have is they have a legal obligation not to work in a manner, among other things, that endangers another worker. In other words, you won't hear a Ministry of Labor inspector say this, but workers have a legal duty not to come to work with COVID. Quite apart from employer obligations, workers have a legal duty to do that. So that should encourage and support your COVID safety plan. It should also encourage and support your initiative to encourage vaccination. Employers have also a legal duty to take every reasonable precaution in the circumstances for the protection of the worker. Interestingly, Ontario, only jurisdiction in Canada that places that same legal obligation under 25(2)(c on its supervisors. So what does that mean? Well, I wish the Ministry of Labor would give guidance on this in the context of vaccine, but in my opinion, it means that if you can mandate mandatory proof of vaccination, that is a very reasonable precaution to require workers to take. However, you can't have that mandatory proof of vaccine policy in place yet because there's limited government supply. What happens if you just cross your fingers, don't have a policy, don't manage this issue well, and somebody gets sick when you could have required them to be vaccinated or otherwise comply with public health, masking, physical distancing, and other issues? Well, you're going to be prosecuted by the Ministry of Labor. The Ministry of Labor will not likely hold workers accountable if they're anti-vaxxers or have vaccine hesitancy, but they will hold you responsible if you let the anti-vaxxer run your workplace, come to workplace with the COVID infection when they could have been vaccinated, spread it. And because we know that physical distancing and masking is not as effective as vaccines, you will be held accountable and you've got serious risk. Legally, you will be prosecuted. There is risk of jail for officers and directors of companies as well as supervisors. So it's important for employers to know they will be held accountable for how they manage the risk of COVID to their workers. So the questions that are often asked are often the wrong questions. I think 3 questions on this slide are the critical questions for employers to ask. Can you as an employer require mandatory proof of vaccination before return to work in close proximity with others without other public health measures in place? Secondly, if the answer is yes, are there human rights legal restrictions on that? And how do you deal with privacy concerns of workers about their vaccine status? Those are easily answered questions. I'm going to deal with those briefly in a moment. And then thirdly, if you're not comfortable with the answer yes to question 1, is it still worthwhile now to have a vaccine safety policy? Perhaps part of your overall COVID safety plan, which is required by law in Ontario of all employers, or a standalone policy. So we're going to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. Health and safety law requires you, the employer, to take overall charge and responsibility for safety of workers, notwithstanding the fact that workers have a legal obligation not to do something like come to work infected. That's why access screening, active access screening, is critical. We know that COVID is spread through congregate settings. We know that it is, if you're vaccinated, 100% effective to prevent serious illness, hospitalization, and likely contracting the disease. So do we wait for the herd immunity to come through spread, or do we promote vaccination? Obviously, the answer is promoting vaccination. Now, if you have a policy that now recommends or strongly encourages workers to get vaccinated when available, again, that's a supply issue. And then when everybody has availability of a second dose, a mandatory proof of vaccination policy, can it be challenged if you're in a unionized work environment? The answer is yes. The standard for review for a unilaterally imposed management rights clause mandatory proof of vaccine policy is going to be measured under the KVP test. KVP is an arbitration case that's been recognized and embedded in the Supreme Court of Canada decision of Irving Pulp and Paper. Essentially, as the third bullet point emphasizes, which it highlights, the policy has to be not unreasonable. Now, probably could just say is reasonable. Lawyers and judges like to do double negatives. It's confusing, but essentially you have to show that it is a reasonable precaution to actually have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy if you're going to go that far. Will that be likely upheld under the KVP test? That's assuming, of course, there is vaccine supply for everybody. My last bullet gives you a little formula to logically and critically think through the issue. So COVID-19, we have high transmissibility of this virus, especially with the variants. Plus, we have very high mortality, sickness, and reasonably high fatality death rates. However, if you take away those 2 factors of COVID-19 pandemic, of the 100% combined efficacy and prevention of hospitalization and death that all 4 of the approved vaccines that have been and are continuing to be available with the AstraZeneca for the moment, what you have logically, reasonably, is a meeting of your occupational health and safety duties as an employer under 25(2)H and that crystallizing in a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. Undoubtedly is going to be reasonable. However, who wants to be the first test case? So it's best to try and work with your union to talk about vaccine policies now and when supply is available. It's important to talk about the big picture of how many people have got sick and died because of this. And it's important to deal with the outliers of anti-vaxxers and vaccine hesitancy with your union. That all should be part of a constructive dialogue where the safety of workers and their extended family is the focus, as opposed to management versus union on pushing management policies. So we're not advocating at this point a mandatory proof of vaccination policy, but in time you have to move to that, or you will be forever paralyzed and forever in the pandemic from your work practices, your additional costs, the fear and the anxiety that all of this pandemic has driven. So just moving ahead, will a proof of mandatory proof of vaccine policy be sustainable if there's sufficient supply? Well, let's look at a case. There is no case on that point, but let's look at a similar case that was decided in December of last year. The Crescent Care nursing home case is one of the few cases that was argued and reasoned well, and had litigants on both sides making their best arguments. Essentially, in a nursing home where there were no current COVID cases, there was a mandatory test of all staff. They asked them to test every 2 weeks. Somebody decided they were an anti-vaxxer and also didn't want to get tested for COVID. A terribly selfish position to take, but nonetheless, they argued that they didn't have to. This is what the arbitrator said. In asking the KVP test, was it reasonable to do a test for COVID? They said, look, the way the employer developed the policy, it wasn't about culpability or blameworthy behavior. It was about health and safety. It was about fitness for duty. It wasn't about morally reprehensible behavior. Secondly, because COVID is a highly infectious disease and deadly for elderly people and also puts the workers at high risk, it was a reasonable policy to test. Also, there was no government guidance at the time. There still isn't about how often you should test. It's all thrown into your lap as the employer. So there's no government or Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development standard for this. There's guidance. It's vague, but it's not a standard you can rely upon to say, look, we're following a government standard. This should be acceptable. So the arbitrator held the policy was consistent with the collective agreements management rights clause. Management has the legal obligation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act to keep workers and third parties safe. The union has, of course, no obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act whatsoever. Doesn't mean you don't have a duty to consult under your collective agreement, but if you can't get an agreement that you think is acceptable and puts safety first, then you're going to have to go it along with the unilateral management policy on the status of your COVID plan. Employers need to develop a COVID vaccine policy. We believe it is arguably from an occupational health and safety law and reasonableness KVP perspective to have a mandatory proof of vaccine policy. Many employers in the US and around the world are implementing them as we speak, especially countries who have more vaccination than we have. However, you can't implement that policy reasonably at the present time because we don't have sufficient supply. It's asking people to do something they don't have the access to do, that is to get the 2 vaccines. The Canadian experiment of the delay of the second vaccine of Pfizer, Moderna, is a problem. It will delay the supply and availability for those who got the first vaccine. Apart from those practical and policy and political issues, dealing with vaccine rollout, when you're in a position, when the country's in a position to have a vaccine for everyone for the second dose, then you need to revisit your policy in consultation with your union as to whether you want to amp it up from strongly recommending you get it to we now require proof of vaccination to come back to the workplace. So safety is the priority. It's the mandate under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. If you don't, as many of my clients now are finding that if you don't have perfect compliance, or even if you do with pre-access rules and compliance with COVID masking, if workers don't follow the rules, it's not the workers who are getting tagged, it's the employers. So you have that overall responsibility. And so you need to consider your vaccine policy. And then you need to deal with human rights and privacy concerns. So I've heard people come out, even some lawyers who are not experienced labor and employment and safety lawyers say, gee, there's privacy laws that prevent this. Well, with great respect, there is no privacy law or statute in Ontario, period. So whoever tells you there's a privacy law that prevents you from having a mandatory proof of vaccine policy, ask them to show you the law and then send it to me. It's hard to send me something that doesn't exist. The provinces talked about doing what BC, Alberta, and Quebec have done, but they've not done it yet. But the more important concern is really human rights laws. People say it's against my human rights to force me to get the vaccine. Look, please be clear, we're not recommending that an employer force any employee to do anything. But if an employee wants to work at your workplace and they're legally required under Section 28 of the Act to come to work and not infect other people, and you have a legal obligation, which if you don't follow, you'll be prosecuted for, then clearly you do have a legal as well as a moral obligation to require workers to get with the program. So most employees are not going to be a problem. There will be a few outliers. Is there a human rights exemption for anybody who's a fearful, vaccine hesitancy person or a committed ideological anti-vaxxer? Short answer, no. An ideological or political position on being an anti-vaxxer is not a human right prohibited ground. Our human rights code is quite simple. There are prohibited grounds of discrimination on which employers cannot discriminate. One of those is disability. Disability means a real or perceived physical or psychological disability, but would not include, according to case law, just some anxiety about getting a vaccine. So who has a disability that must be respected in this context? Well, it's somebody who has reasonable basis objectively from their doctor to say, look, I'm at risk of an adverse allergic or other reaction. I can't get a vaccine to prevent me from getting COVID-19. If you have a person like that, and you have to build that acceptance into your policy, then they will be orange lighted. So you have a green person will likely be working meters apart, masked forever, and or given assignments where they can work at home. If you can't accommodate that worker to the point of undue hardship, they can be laid off lawfully. You have a duty to work with the worker has a duty to work with you. There must be exchange in good faith of medical information about what the nature of the disability is and how it may be accommodated. The red light, in my view of green, orange, and red light under your policy, is going to be people who say, I don't have a disability, I could take the vaccine, I'm just not going to. And your mandatory proof of vaccine policy, when supply is sufficient, can, in my view, result in that policy being enforced, and you just decline to employ, lay off, or terminate employees who are in such a position. What that person essentially saying is, I don't care about my health, the health and safety of other workers, and perhaps my family community. I have an ideological position that is, yes, fundamentally irrational, contrary to science, and therefore I'm going to stand alone and reject your policy. To make that as a condition of employment is not unreasonable, especially with the serious and very high legal risk and liability employers have, and the moral responsibility employers have to the safety of workers. Now, this is a view, this is guidance, this is not confirmed in any case law. Many lawyers are uncomfortable with being as confident as I am in saying there is a occupational health and safety legal framework that supports the mandatory proof of vaccine approach. Clearly, that is still subject to case law. Clearly, if there's a ruling contrary to my view and through some circumstances that I couldn't foresee, this is not legal advice to you, but it's guidance. But more importantly, it's helping you to calmly think through the issues, look at the legal responsibility you have for the safety of workers, and take the moral and legal high ground of ensuring your workers are healthy and safe. What are the privacy issues? Well, essentially, a person's vaccine status is a personal, confidential medical piece of information. So if you are to collect that, as most employers in the US and the UK are doing now, yet on a voluntary basis, you ask for consent. Then when you collect it, you limit the amount of data you need to collect. You don't need to know the name of the vaccine. You just need to know the second dose, or if the Johnson & Johnson, I suppose you would need to know the last dose of when it was received. Then you count the prescribed 2 weeks or whatever the particular vaccine requires you to do, and then you will know that the person is fully vaccinated. Then, subject to the Ministry of Labor, Training and Skills Development, Ministry of Health, and all of their enforcement officers saying differently, you will likely be allowed to have that person work unmasked in close proximity because they are fully protected. And in the US and the UK, their view is that they can work in close proximity without risk of transmission. When you've got a group of workers who have all got the vaccine, they are not able to give it to each other, even if there's that slight 4 or 5% or slightly higher, depending on the vaccine you have, of actually getting it. So herd or population immunity comes from the congregate group of workers all being vaccinated. Hopefully the logic is clear. Now, that privacy data is kept confidential, and it's only kept for the length of the period you need to be able to verify indeed that the person is vaccinated and when. So when you no longer employ that worker, you no longer need that data. That data should not be distributed to anybody for any other purpose other than lawfully the policy, compliance, and in fact, the request of government for proof of it. Hopefully that makes it clear. So again, human rights law may protect somebody with a disability or perhaps a sincerely held religious belief against vaccination if it's consistent with an objective, provable religious requirement, very, very rare, or a disability based on a medical reaction to the vaccine. Otherwise, there is no human rights law protection for just an outside kind of thought or an anti-vaxxer that says, I don't like vaccinations. So questions to ask before you develop your policy. I'm just going to, because we're short for time, going to commend those to you. I've covered most of those points already. I've been helping clients in construction and other industries deal with the 10 issues that we think should be in your vaccine policy. None of them yet have gone to mandatory proof of vaccination, but they are collecting data voluntarily from employees when they are vaccinated. So that will help the employer and help the employees get back to work to a more normal situation because the vaccine is the way of the pandemic. So back to the questions. Does occupational health and safety law support, it doesn't require, but does it support the implementation of employers' policy that protects employees from the spread and the adverse effects of COVID-19? Yes. So may employers require proof of vaccination before they work in close proximity where they cannot be there in connection with workers or third parties? I think the answer is yes in most circumstances when supply is available. Are there human rights and privacy concerns you need to be aware of? Yes, that need to be built into your policy. If you're not comfortable, or if you get other legal advice that says, no, we don't want to go to a mandatory proof of vaccination policy, should we still have a policy? The answer, of course, is yes. So there you go. There's a bad picture of me and some contact information. Over to Giovanni. Thank you for your patience and me rushing through a lot of material quickly.
Norm, your presentations are always so thought-provoking, and the questions that have come in reflect that you're hitting a nerve, and I'm glad that you take a position and you're not wishy-washy. But as Norm stated, this is not legal advice. This is an opinion. If you need legal advice on any specific case, please reach out to him specifically, and then he'll discuss the pertinent matters of that case. But one question that came up repeatedly is, when should workplaces have their vaccination policies ready or available? Because we can't really enforce it, but you did mention that we should have it. So what is the timing like? We should have it now?
Yes, I think you should have your COVID-19 vaccination policy now. The part, I think it's number 3 in the way I've designed the standard policy we're using. Number 3 is the choice of, is it just a strong recommendation based on various medical authorities you get vaccinated, or at that point you put mandatory proof of vaccination. I'm not recommending anybody today have a mandatory proof of vaccination policy in place because we don't have enough supply. That's an unfair criteria, an unfair condition of employment. But in the policy, you build in, as public guidance changes, as supply vaccine changes, we may change and update our policy. Look, you may get such a good response in your workplace, you may never have to go to mandatory proof of vaccination. You may get a really good buy-in. And then for the people who you know, because they've self-declared or refused to confirm they've got a vaccination, you may have to accommodate them if they have a disability, or you may have to say goodbye to them if they're just an outlier and they're difficult and refuse to follow a sensible policy. But get the policy in place now. Work with your union if possible to get it in place, either individually or in your sector. And then as supply comes out, revisit the issue of whether you should make the strong recommendation to get the vaccination to a mandatory proof of vaccination.
So very interesting question on the condition of employment. What if you've had a worker that has already contracted COVID-19 and you as an employer make it mandatory for them as, again, condition of employment to prove that they've been vaccinated in order to return?
Right. Let me put that very important question in the context of, you don't require that person to get vaccinated because they've had COVID. They get COVID again, which we know they can. They infect somebody else and they die. The Ministry of Labor will investigate. The Ministry of Labor will prosecute you as the employer for not having either had self-isolated that worker, prevented them from coming to the workplace, or accommodating them by putting them where they can't transmit the disease. In other words, here's the thing that really the government has failed construction on. They have failed to say, look, it's not your fault if COVID gets transmitted by a worker's negligence or a worker's breach of their duty. They have not committed to saying we will not prosecute. In fact, I'm dealing with some prosecutions where COVID has been transmitted and it's not the employer's fault. So because and until you see guidance and a strong assurance from the Ontario government and the Ministry of Labor, you must protect the worker, even if the worker doesn't want to be protected in that example. Otherwise, when you go to court and you say to a judge, well, the reason that worker infected another worker and they died is not our fault, they're going to say, did you take due diligence? Did you take every precaution reasonable within your powers as an employer in the circumstances to protect every worker? And if you don't have a strong vaccine policy and you let somebody who previously had COVID now doesn't want to get the vaccine in and among other workers, that's not going to be every precaution reasonable. So you've got to put yourself in the mindset of a judge looking at you and saying, could there be even one more reasonable step that you took, i.e. a strict adherence to a COVID-19 vaccine policy that you didn't do? And if you could do that, why didn't you? Somebody died as a result and you're going to be prosecuted and convicted. So you're getting no sympathy from courts unless you've done everything. You're getting no guidance on this issue from the government. So you're left up to the legal framework that I've given you to support your commitment to worker safety and legal compliance.
So interesting that you would raise that. Now, you've got employers that are doing everything they can. And I know in our industry, we go above and beyond because construction, that's just the nature of it. We're all about health and safety. But what if you have a situation, and again, this is only in the unionized realm, where they've been advised that the unionized employees cannot be required to be vaccinated. Like, you can't do it as a condition of work. I heard you initially say that, obviously open lines of communication and whatnot, but if the onus is on the employer, what more can we do?
Look, if you sit down with your union and you try to hammer out a good, progressive, and very responsible COVID-19 vaccine policy, and they balk, they said, no, you can't tell our workers what to do. If we have anti-vaxxers in our ranks, they have a right to be ideologically committed to no vaccines, but you still have to employ them. Then you may have to lay somebody off or discipline somebody. Then you will have a grievance arbitration. Then you will likely win. However, if you don't, then at least you've got that effort, even the litigation with the grievance, that you can show to a court, or that you can show somebody else's grievance arbitration to a court and say, look, we have tried. We have, for crying out loud, we have done everything reasonable, including litigate the issue. And for some reason, some arbitrator has decided, no, we have to take the anti-vaxxer. We have to let them prance around the construction site, cough on whoever they want to, and we're stuck with that. So this is where, unfortunately, a very high level of commitment of the current provincial government to prosecute for employers for failure to comply, which You know, they prosecute far more than any other province in Canada as a method of enforcement. No guidance for employers and unions on the vaccine issuing workplaces, especially construction. You were left on your own. So you have to look at the legal framework and ask yourself the question, in our circumstances, are we taking every reasonable precaution? And if one of those reasonable precautions, a very firm and clear mandatory proof of vaccine policy, is challenged by the union, you're better to litigate that issue than to deal with somebody who's sick. The Ministry of Labor comes in, blames you, and you're being prosecuted in court, and an officer director of the company as well might be blamed and has a risk of going to jail. So until we see a change in the approach of enforcement of safety in the province, which most jurisdictions in Canada have a much more collaborative partnering approach than we currently have in Ontario. Until we see the change of that, you are at legal risk if you don't take that every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to protect workers, even if workers are fighting you on the issue of vaccine.
So you had mentioned that you can't mandate it in the realm of vaccinations and stuff. Can you request it? Can I sit there and say, if you've been vaccinated, I as an employer would like to know, can you present me with a letter or your receipt that you've been vaccinated? Is that another way around it as opposed to mandating it?
Right. I mean, right now, my general guidance says you cannot have a mandatory proof of vaccination policy, and you also can't make it a condition of employment to show proof that you have been vaccinated. They're essentially two sides of the same coin, but you can ask for that, and you ask for it politely, respectfully, and persistently. And you assure them that it's only for the purpose of managing safety on the job site. It's for the purpose of hopefully lifting of restrictions for physical distancing, for masking, and for other criteria when allowed. And you're only going to keep track of it for the purposes of occupational health and safety and for another purpose. And when that purpose is gone, you will destroy that data. You have to secure the data, just like you would secure somebody's driver's license, just like you'd secure somebody's social insurance number. You need that data to be able to allow people to work and or to drive vehicles on your construction site. The whole idea of a vaccine passport is catching on everywhere around the world except Canada. We're slow off the mark on that as well. The European Union has invited American tourists to go there this summer without masking requirements if, in fact, they have 2 doses and it's 2 weeks afterwards. There's a recognition internationally of the value of confirming you have got the vaccination, fully vaccinated. So we're slow off the mark. We'll eventually, in my opinion, get there in Canada. But in the meantime, to keep workers safe, you have to manage the risk. And then eventually, I think when you have vaccines fully available, then you may want to consider at that point a mandatory proof of vaccination. But in the meantime, there's nothing wrong for asking for people's cooperation and consent to confirm, have you got 2 doses? When do you get the 2nd dose? Give me the date. I don't care about the, the vaccine you got. I just want to record that in our personnel file so we know that you are safe and protected. That is the simple goal. It's not controversial. It's very common sense. However, if you don't do it and then there is transmission, then you're at serious legal risk of being investigated and prosecuted.
Okay, so on the flip side, now that we're talking about the workers that are vaccinated, what about those that, again, I'm an anti-vaxxer, I refuse to get vaccinated. Can you as an employer ask for a medical rationale from a doctor or a practitioner in order to demonstrate that they can't get it, like if there is a medical reason, or if they're just an anti-vaxxer, can you ask for some sort of written proof from them, basically to put in a file, again, as due diligence?
Yes, and you've hit the nail on the head with the phrase due diligence. If you just take their word for it and don't get medical proof from a medical practitioner that they in fact have a risk of an adverse reaction to the vaccine, then you are not getting objective evidence. You're just getting the subjective say-so of the worker. In my opinion, that is insufficient. Many courts have said in this and other contexts that simply trusting a worker, to be honest, is not objective evidence, in fact, that they have a disability. If they have a disability, it's dealt with discreetly. You speak to them privately, you ask for proof, and they provide it. And if they don't provide it, in the meantime, they've got to be, fully protected with masking and physical distancing, et cetera, and or they have to be laid off until they can prove that they have a disability, and therefore, at that point, you do the accommodation. The challenge will be, of course, if everybody in the crew is vaccinated and somebody can't be vaccinated, they might be seen as an outcast or an anti-vaxxer, which they're not. They're just physically and medically unable to be vaccinated. If that's the case, and it's 1 out of 50, then herd immunity is going to protect that person. That's the whole point of everybody else getting the vaccination. So being vaccinated, you are able to, protects in effect the right of the person who can't be vaccinated and their vulnerability. But you can absolutely ask for that. There's a whole bunch of human rights accommodation cases that talk about a duty on the part of the worker to cooperate with management to sort out the process and the terms of any accommodation. And that starts with, just like in a workers' compensation case, the functional abilities, what you can do, what you can't do. Can you be medically vaccinated or not? If so, why not? And then we'll go from there. So being sensitive to the worker who physically can't or medically can't be vaccinated is a critical part of your policy to respect that and to accommodate them as required by human rights law.
So in the same vein, if I've got a worker that refuses to wear a mask because they say they have a medical condition, I can ask for proof of that medical condition in order to allow them that exception, correct?
Yes. Now, human rights commissions around the country have given opinions on this, and some say yes, and some say no, you don't need medical proof. I get it that it's uncomfortable to wear a mask. It is for everybody. For some people that have severe anxiety, they physically can't. There might be an exception now and again, but fundamentally, then they're at risk of spreading it and getting it. So, you can ask and need to ask for medical proof if you want to acknowledge or to have evidence that there is a disability on the part of a worker. Being sensitive in how you do it, being respectful in how you do it is a better way to get to a good solution than being aggressive. But nonetheless, it's still reasonable for the employer to ask for medical proof of a disability and then to deal with the accommodation issue.
So I know you've touched upon it in your presentation, but we have a specific question on how you can handle workers who refuse to get vaccinated or screened. I'm assuming, you've just got to make sure that you've got documentation.
Yeah, you've got to document your general communication. You've got to then have, a follow-up meeting, a physically distanced meeting with that type of worker to make sure they've been reminded of the importance of it and encourage them to talk to their doctor, the union's doctor, or someone else other than perhaps the dark web on conspiracy theories about mRNA vaccine and how it's going to chew up your organs. There's all sorts of craziness out there. And say, look, this is not just for you, it's for your fellow workers and for your family and community. And I think most people get it. I think COVID's put a lot of strain on everybody's, mental well-being and mental health at times. And so being calm, being authoritative in terms of the medical source, if we can't trust Health Canada, who approved all these vaccines, if we can't trust our doctors to give us assurance to take them, then we're all in a deep pile of manure that we don't even want to think about. So we have to have some measure of trust in the experts. And that trust may be eroded by the odd outlier or the odd pullback on a vaccine. But, generally, I think we need to look to medical advice, and all the best advice is saying, go get the vaccine. I just hope we get more supply so we can get this thing done.
Agreed on the supply side of things. But interesting enough, there are certain specific questions in regards to, okay, you know what? You had mentioned that you really can't mandate it. You can't make it mandatory. But what if there are certain jurisdictions, like long-term care homes, for instance, right? Can you have an actual mandatory policy there because of the high risk, that you have about the fatality or the mortality? If it's implemented as a mandatory policy there, would that fit into your discussion?
Absolutely. Well, they are for two reasons. And it was on one of the bullets, but I skipped over it because it didn't so much apply to construction. Hospitals that have cleaning staff, that have cafeteria staff that are on contract. Under the contract, the contracting cleaning or cafeteria company, food services company, has to only allow people that have been fully vaccinated in, period.
Regardless of human rights or anything, correct?
Yeah. So that's quite apart from any employment law concerns. That's a breach of contract. And so, So we're into a very interesting commercial contractual provision that might actually be imposed, let's say, by a general contractor on a sub-trade or an owner on a subcontractor. We're not there yet in construction and in general, partly because that's not where the higher risk people are if they get COVID for adverse outcomes. But again, it goes back to supply.
100%. So we have two, I'm very, the timing, we've gone over, but this is such a controversial topic that everyone's still on. We've only had a couple who have left, one being Ron, who has to run to yet another meeting because he's got back-to-back meetings. But is there any template available in regards to the vaccination policy, Norm?
We've developed one at our firm. I'm reluctant to hand it out because that just might give the wrong impression to people. If you want to retain myself, someone at my firm, or another lawyer to review or draft a policy, be happy to do that. We'll try and keep costs down. There is no magic policy or magic bullet that will deal with this. It needs to be tailored to your particular industry or sub-industry in construction, and also what you feel comfortable in doing. Clearly, it's uncharted territory. The unfortunate part is that there should be a Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development vaccine policy template. There isn't. So it would be nice if Ron put a word in the minister's ear and said, look, for construction, can you develop this? Can you get all the stakeholders together? Can we all agree that this is the expectation of the Ministry of Labor? Because if you have 10 different policies for 10 different contractors, you're all going to be scrutinized differently. It would be really nice if the government stepped up and really helped the industry in this area rather than have to retain legal counsel to develop your own. If they don't, give me a call.
I was going to say, I can't believe you're saying that we shouldn't go to legal counsel.
Oh, no. But this is bigger. This is bigger than just getting another file or another client. This is about the health and safety of construction workers, all workers and their families and communities. So pulling together and not going to a mentality of aggressive enforcement. I could go on a 20-minute rant, which we don't have time for, about how many of my clients have been really treated poorly by the new inspectors and by old inspectors during COVID. There is a multiplicity of charges I'm defending related to COVID and non-COVID related matters that have construction clients screaming, saying, why is the Ministry of Labor not supporting us? Why are they continuing this aggressive policing and blaming of us? And eventually, I hope, after we're through COVID, Giovanni, you and I and others in the industry can get together and try to talk to the Ministry of Labor and saying, look, this blame game is not getting anybody anywhere, and it's certainly not improving safety in the industry. It's actually putting more people on edge, and it's tying things up in the courts. It's not the way to improve safety in construction. But that's a bigger conversation for a different day.
Well, we're actually connecting with the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development in regards to enforcement on that topic specifically, because we do believe that it needs to be renewed or refreshed or at least reviewed wholesomely in order to get things done properly. Because from the OGCA standpoint, we've heard very similar, and we've actually referred them to you in regards to, I can't help you, that I'm not a lawyer, but talk to Norm on this one. And I think we could probably have a separate and distinct webinar just on all the cases that are coming up and how they affect the industry. One last question. I think it's more of a hypothetical in this case, because I don't know if once you get vaccinated for COVID, are you done? Or what if it becomes a yearly recurrence like the flu shot? Does this then have to be part of our health and safety forever?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the pharmaceutical companies, for their selfish interest, as well as public health, government officials and scientists will give us that information over time. I think it's probably very likely that there will be an annual booster shot similar to the flu shot, and it might be pretty simple and it might be very effective. That's really something beyond my legal expertise that I really can't comment on. But if it is, then it might be a continuing reasonable precaution that employers have to say, look, where's your proof of your annual flu shot? Now, you don't want to turn employers into, the babysitters of their workers' health and safety, but in effect, that's the standard you're at right now in the pandemic, in terms of the duty to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. As long as employers are working hard with unions, with their worker members in good faith to make the workplace safe, that's the primary goal. Then the question is, well, how do we apply that goal to the vaccine rollout? And encouraging people now, and then maybe even requiring them as a mandatory proof of vaccination policy later when there's more supply, is one of the ways to achieve that goal. But the goal is the laud-worthy goal that people need to buy into and hopefully work together on. So there's not labor management divisions or government employer divisions, but there's a common goal. And that's why guidance from the Ministry of Labor on vaccine policy would be very, very helpful.
And so whatever occurs on the vaccine policies, or if this becomes a yearly recurrence or whatnot, the OGCA, obviously in tandem with Norm and the other APP members, are always going to be there to provide information to our membership, to the industry at large, and to just get through this. I think overall, that's what we're all trying to do. Norm had mentioned, he touched upon how we not only have I guess the requirement for our own workplaces and our families, but like Canada in general and globally, this is now something that is bigger than just, a single company or a single ministry. This is a global pandemic. And I think we've got to look at it as such. So we've got one last question and then we'll wrap things up here, Norm. It says here, in response to the pandemic, what about other measures that have been deemed appropriate for worker safety and transmission prevention? How does this affect other measures? An example, requiring a worker to be clean shaven for proper N95 fitting. Is that something that you can actually demand now? And I'm saying obviously for myself, but like what's going on?
I think those type of specific rules will have to be, addressed for the type of work, the type of workplace, and the risk. Is it risk of COVID transmission or is it not? The N95 mask was much coveted this time last year and not available. There was political issues about it. The N95 mask is sure preferable if you mask up your crew before they're vaccinated at a construction site, but it's not legally required. There is very little guidance on the quality of the mask you need. Some, as you can see when you walk around town or at a construction site, vary in quality. You want the best personal protective equipment or mask, and you want it to fit and function as best you can. If somebody has a bushy beard, like maybe a Toronto Maple Leaf hockey player that looks about 100 years old when you watch Mr. Thornton, I don't know how he would wear a mask. So you're going to have to deal with those on a case-by-case basis. But I think the goal, if we can keep that in mind, is to keep workers safe. The question is, how do we get there, and what guidance are we getting and support are we getting from governments to set proper and appropriate standards? I think if people are working in good faith, management, union workers, and the regulator together, that's how we get to a better place, not by sniping at each other or unnecessary enforcement and prosecutions by Ministry of Labor inspectors who are keen to advance their careers.
Norm.
Oops, did I say that? Did I say that out loud? I'm sorry. I love every Ministry of Labor inspector. I love them all.
The opinions expressed of Mr. Norm Keith are not those of the OGCA.
Yeah.
Listen, thank you very much for your time. Again, I would have thanked Ron, but he had to exit for yet another meeting. He's incredibly busy and is providing us with up-to-date, timely information. Norm, you've been fantastic. For all those who are watching, we are packaging this up. We'll have the recording as well as all the information. If anyone has any specific questions, please refer to Norm directly on the legal side of things. If it's in relation to vaccinations in general that Ron touched upon, the OGCA is happy to take any of the questions ourselves and then forward them to Ron for response. Overall, we want to thank all the participants. We want to thank the industry. We want to thank Norm and Ron for a riveting presentation today. Stay tuned for more to come. We'll have more for everyone coming soon for more presentations on from the OGCA's webinar series. Thank you, one and all. Have a great day. Was it stay positive, test negative?
Perfect.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Take care.